For nearly 3 decades, Sean Diddy Combs moved through hip-hop like an untouchable force. Artists didn't just collaborate with him, they adjusted around him. Executives didn't just negotiate, they chose their words carefully. And when people crossed him, the fallout was rarely loud, but it was always real. Careers slowed down, opportunities disappeared, doors quietly closed. That was the system. But inside that system, there was one man who broke every unspoken rule and somehow walked away untouched. One rapper who mocked him, named him, challenged him publicly, again and again and again. And Diddy never responded. No diss track, no interview, no lawsuit, no warning, nothing. That man was Eminem. And today, we're breaking down why that silence matters, what made Eminem different from everyone else, and how a decades-long pattern tells a story far bigger than any rap beef. Now, real quick, if you like deep dives that connect dots instead of just repeating headlines, subscribe to I Love Gossip, because stories like this don't live on the surface, they live in patterns. All right, let's get into it. This was never about album sales. It wasn't about awards. And it definitely wasn't about shock value. Eminem didn't move like most artists who challenged power. Most rappers who go at industry giants still depend on the same system they're attacking. They need radio, they need relationships, they need approval, and that dependence makes them vulnerable. Eminem didn't need any of that. His success came directly from the fans. His audience didn't rely on gatekeepers. His music didn't need permission. Once an artist reaches that level of independence, traditional industry pressure stops working. But independence alone doesn't explain why nothing ever came back his way. Plenty of independent artists still get checked. So why not Eminem? The answer begins with reputation. For years, stories circulated quietly through hip-hop about Eminem. Not as someone reckless, but as someone who simply didn't bend. Someone who didn't play certain politics. Someone who didn't scare easily, someone who didn't fold under pressure. Whether every story is true or not isn't the point. In hip-hop culture, reputation becomes reality, and Eminem's reputation was simple. If you press him, he won't fold, and he won't stop. That reputation alone changes how people move around you. Then there were the lyrics. This is where the pattern becomes impossible to ignore. Eminem didn't mention Diddy once. He didn't throw one subliminal and move on. He referenced him across decades of music, early underground records, mainstream albums heard by millions, lines hidden inside songs aimed at completely different artists, sometimes direct, sometimes sarcastic, sometimes wrapped in humor. But the message stayed consistent, and every single time, the result was the same: silence. In hip-hop, that's not normal. This is a culture built on response, on ego, on reputation. Repeated public disrespect almost always demands a reply. But Diddy never gave one, year after year, album after album. The silence itself became the story. Because when someone responds to almost everyone, but never to one specific person, that tells you something. It tells you that engaging isn't worth the risk. Then came the moment that shifted everything. Years later, during a completely different rap battle, Eminem dropped a line that wasn't even aimed at Diddy, yet instantly pulled him into the spotlight. The line was brief, the implication was heavy, and the confidence behind it was unsettling. It didn't sound exaggerated. It didn't sound like shock value. It sounded casual, like someone speaking without fear of consequences. The internet erupted. Reaction videos exploded across YouTube. Forums lit up. Fans waited for a response. And once again, nothing. No denial, no clarification, no statement. At that point, the silence stopped looking strategic. It started looking deliberate. Because when someone can say almost anything publicly and nothing happens, it suggests something deeper about the balance of power. Eminem wasn't just throwing insults. He was demonstrating that the usual rules didn't apply to him, and that's rare. Years later, when real-world controversies involving Diddy began dominating headlines, fans went back and re-examined Eminem's lyrics, not as jokes, not as wild bars, but as commentary. Lines that once felt outrageous suddenly felt uncomfortable, not because Eminem predicted anything, but because he felt confident enough to say what others wouldn't say, long before it was socially safe to say it. That confidence didn't come from ignorance. It came from security. And that's where the story gets even more interesting, because Eminem wasn't operating alone. Throughout his career, he aligned himself with people known for loyalty, not convenience, relationships that weren't transactional, alliances that didn't disappear when things got uncomfortable. In an industry where partnerships often collapse under pressure, Eminem's closest relationships stayed intact for decades. That kind of loyalty matters, because power isn't just money or influence. It's knowing someone has your back when pressure comes. And pressure never came. That's the part that stands out. For someone who built a reputation on control, silence can be more revealing than confrontation. Because confronting Eminem would have meant stepping into territory that couldn't be controlled, lyrically, publicly, or culturally. Eminem didn't need approval. He didn't need protection from the industry. And he didn't fear consequences. That made him unpredictable. And unpredictable people are dangerous to systems built on fear. What's even more telling is what didn't happen.
Dissolve the relationship between me and them, it'd be pretty tough for us to have an argument, because I hold them in the kind of regards I hold my grandparents in.
I noticed that.
You know, he provided opportunity for me to take care of myself when I couldn't at that point. Like, I actually couldn't make it happen without the assistance that I got from him.
He seems like the only person you are loyal.
There were no lawsuits, no public corrections, no industry pushback. When lines were crossed, nothing followed. That absence of reaction spoke louder than any diss track ever could. It suggested that responding might open doors better left closed. And that's when fans started connecting dots. Not because Eminem claimed to know secrets, but because he moved like someone who wasn't afraid of what might come next. That's a powerful position. As the years passed and more stories surfaced publicly about the industry, Eminem's decades-long posture began to look less like arrogance and more like distance. Distance from politics, distance from control, distance from fear. In hip-hop, power usually flows downward, but Eminem existed outside that flow. And when someone exists outside the system loses leverage. That's why the silence matters. Not because of what was said, but because of what wasn't. No one tried to shut him down. No one tried to discredit him. No one tried to stop him. They let him speak. And that tells you everything. Because the loudest moments in hip-hop history aren't always diss records. Sometimes they're the moments where nobody says a word. That silence stretched across decades, and it left behind a clear message. Some people can't be controlled. Some people won't be intimidated. And some people are simply beyond reach. Eminem didn't win a beef. He proved that he never had to fight one. And in a culture built on dominance, that might be the most powerful statement of all. By the time Eminem had established himself as a global superstar, something unusual was already happening behind the scenes. The normal rules of hip-hop power didn't seem to apply to him. Most artists, no matter how successful, eventually run into invisible limits. They learn which names not to say, which doors not to knock on, which lines not to cross. Eminem never learned those rules. Or maybe he simply didn't care. Because while other rappers carefully navigated industry politics, Eminem moved with a level of confidence that suggested something else was protecting him. Something deeper than record sales or public popularity. To understand why, you have to look at who stood around him, not just what he said on records. In hip-hop, power isn't just money. It's not just influence. It's not just fame. Power is backing, and Eminem had it. From early in his career, Eminem built relationships that weren't based on convenience or clout. They were built on loyalty. And in an industry known for fragile alliances, that loyalty never broke. One of the most important relationships in Eminem's career wasn't just artistic. It was personal. Dr. Dre. This wasn't just a producer-artist relationship. Dre didn't just co-sign Eminem. he stood beside him. And Dre wasn't just a hitmaker. He was someone who had already survived the most dangerous eras of hip-hop politics. Dre knew what intimidation looked like. He knew how power moved, and he knew when not to play games. That alone mattered, but it didn't stop there. When Eminem signed 50 Cent, the equation changed completely. This wasn't just a business decision, this was a merging of two forces that complemented each other in a way the industry rarely sees. Eminem brought raw authenticity, creative dominance, and a fan base that couldn't be controlled. 50 Cent brought reputation, fearlessness, and a history that made people think twice before testing him. Together, they formed a front that couldn't be easily pressured, and more importantly, it couldn't be divided. In hip-hop, most beefs escalate because someone can be isolated, someone can be cornered, someone can be pressured quietly. That didn't work here. Anyone thinking about pressing Eminem wasn't just dealing with one artist. They were dealing with an entire ecosystem built on loyalty, and loyalty changes everything, because loyalty doesn't disappear when money is offered, it doesn't fold when threats are implied, and it doesn't back down when things get uncomfortable. That kind of backing doesn't show up in contracts, it shows up in silence. Silence from people who normally respond. Silence from people who normally retaliate. And that silence wasn't accidental, it was strategic. Now let's talk about something rarely discussed publicly: fear in the industry. Hip-hop doesn't like to admit fear exists. It hides behind bravado, ego, and competition. But behind closed doors, fear shapes decisions every day. Fear of retaliation, fear of exposure, fear of escalation. Eminem represented all three. He wasn't just lyrically dangerous, he was unpredictable. He didn't threaten people. He didn't posture. He didn't warn. He just spoke. And that's the most dangerous kind of person. Because when someone isn't trying to intimidate you, it means they're not worried about the outcome. That mindset forces powerful people to pause, because engaging with someone like that risks opening doors you can't close. Every response becomes a gamble. Every word becomes evidence. Every escalation becomes a spotlight. And some spotlights reveal things better left unseen. This is why silence can be more powerful than confrontation. Responding to Eminem would have meant acknowledging him as a threat. Ignoring him allowed plausible distance, and distance was safety. What's even more telling is how Eminem never backed down, not even when the implications of his lyrics grew heavier. Most artists test boundaries once, then retreat. Eminem didn't. He repeated the behavior, album after album, year after year. That repetition wasn't accidental. It was confidence. Confidence built on the understanding that no one was going to touch him. And no one did. Now fast forward to a time when the industry itself started shifting. Old protections weakened, old stories resurfaced, old power structures began cracking. Suddenly, narratives that once felt untouchable were being re-examined, and fans started noticing something unsettling. Eminem's lyrics hadn't changed. There comes a moment in every long-running power story where silence stops being strategy and starts becoming evidence. For years, Eminem's words floated through hip-hop like background noise to some, like warnings to others. They were easy to dismiss when everything looked stable, when the industry was comfortable, when the old structures still held. But time has a way of changing perspective. As years passed and the culture shifted, people started revisiting moments they once ignored, lyrics they once laughed at, lines they once brushed off as exaggeration, and suddenly the silence surrounding those moments felt heavier. Because what stood out wasn't just what Eminem said, it was what never followed. No pushback, no denials, no attempts to reframe the narrative. In an industry built on controlling stories, that absence became impossible to ignore. As new conversations began dominating hip-hop about accountability, power, and long-hidden behavior, the contrast grew sharper. Figures once seen as untouchable were suddenly being questioned, old alliances were being re-examined, and long-suppressed discussions were finally happening out loud. In that moment, people realized something unsettling. Eminem never changed his tone. The world did. What once sounded outrageous now sounded less far-fetched. Not because Eminem had secret knowledge, but because he had always been speaking from a position outside the system. And that position gave him freedom. Freedom from optics, freedom from approval, freedom from fear. Most artists soften over time. They become cautious, they protect relationships, they choose silence to preserve access. Eminem didn't. He stayed distant, he stayed sharp, he stayed unconcerned with fallout. That consistency is rare. And it forces an uncomfortable question. Why was he able to operate like that when others couldn't? The answer lies in what never happened. There were no lawsuits, no public campaigns to discredit him, no industry-wide attempts to isolate him. When he crossed lines that would have ended other careers, nothing followed. That tells you the system didn't know how to deal with him. Because pressure only works when someone needs something from you, and Eminem didn't. He didn't need radio play, he didn't need approval, he didn't need protection from the industry. His audience stayed with him regardless. That made him immune to the most common form of control, and when control fails, power becomes cautious. This is where the silence takes on new meaning, because silence wasn't about ignoring a diss. It was about avoiding escalation. Escalation invites scrutiny. Scrutiny invites questions. And questions invite attention. Attention is dangerous when you've spent years managing perception, so the safest move was distance, and distance became policy. What's striking is how consistent that policy remained, even as circumstances changed, even as narratives shifted, even as conversations grew louder, even as the industry itself began to crack. Still, no response. That kind of restraint isn't accidental, it's calculated, and it reveals fear, not of Eminem's words alone, but of what engaging him might unleash. Because Eminem never spoke like someone testing boundaries. He spoke like someone who already knew where they were. And when someone speaks from that position, the usual defenses don't work. This is why Eminem's presence in the culture has always felt separate. He wasn't fighting for dominance. He wasn't chasing validation. He wasn't demanding respect. He acted like he already had it. And that forced everyone else to adapt. In hip-hop, dominance usually comes from loud victories, from public wins, from visible power. But Eminem's dominance was quiet. It showed up in what didn't happen, in who didn't respond, in who didn't challenge him, in who chose silence instead. That kind of dominance doesn't fade with time. If anything, it grows. Because as more stories surfaced and more conversations unfolded, the contrast became undeniable. The artist who said the most never had to defend himself. The mogul who controlled narratives never challenged him. That imbalance tells a story no diss track ever could. It shows how power really works when fear enters the equation. Fear doesn't always shout. Sometimes it stays quiet, sometimes it steps back, sometimes it pretends not to hear, and that's exactly what happened here. Eminem didn't dismantle an empire, he didn't expose secrets, he didn't demand accountability. He simply existed beyond reach. And that alone changed the dynamic. Because when someone proves they can't be silenced, can't be controlled, and can't be pressured, they redefine the rules for everyone else. They show that power doesn't always belong to the loudest voice. Sometimes it belongs to the one no one dares to confront. As hip-hop continues to evolve, this story remains a reminder. Not about beef, not about diss records, not about rivalries, but about structure, about who controls narratives and who exists outside them. Eminem didn't win a war. He made it unnecessary. And the silence that followed speaks louder than any response ever could. If this breakdown made you see the story differently, like the video, if it made you think, share it. And if you want more deep dives that go beyond the surface, subscribe to I Love Gossip. Because in hip-hop, the truth isn't always in what's said. Sometimes it's in what no one dares to answer.